Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Political Prude, the podcast. Now, before we dive in, take a second to follow the podcast and leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and thumbs up so that you guys don't miss a single episode. This season on Political Prude, I'm on a mission to find out how things work in Singapore. Now, something that I have really quite been interested in is policy making. When there's a problem, how does it actually evolve into policy? Who identifies the gaps? How are solutions debated, designed, implemented? And when tough decisions have to be made, what goes into weighing the trade-offs? To help me understand, I'm speaking to someone who's been in the thick of it.
Minister of State for Home Affairs,
Social and Family Development, Sun Xueling.
Sun Xueling.
I am Sun Xueling.
No offense, right? People are always very skeptical of government outreach. What people don't want to see is something that's performative.
We don't pass laws for the sake of just passing laws and ticking a checkbox to say I have a law.
Sexual violence is one of the themes that mattered the most to women.
Victims in Singapore have lost 6 million Singapore dollars.
What is that consideration process like as to what is more urgent to tackle?
So that's urgent. It needs to be addressed. And then there are also longer term issues whereby actually you need to have various building blocks in place before you can effect change meaningfully.
We also cannot disregard that there's a maybe minority that really hates it.
We must be able to live by our decisions, knowing that what we decide to do today doesn't just impact the people around us here today. It's going to impact generations to come.
She's the MP for Punggol West and the Minister of State for Home Affairs and Social and Family Development. Now, since 2015, she's worked on policies spanning childcare, social support, urban planning, and even cybercrime. But how does she go from identifying an issue to crafting policies? In a system where every policy has ripple effects, how does she balance competing interests? What happens when a policy doesn't work as expected? And how much say does an individual policymaker really have? I'm bringing all my questions and maybe some of yours to the table. Let's get into it. Ms. Sun Xueling, welcome to Political Prude, the podcast.
Hi, Joel.
Yep. So before we jump into it, let me just set the stage, right? Because I feel like this podcast is a little bit different from what other shows are out there. And I feel like the show actually reaches quite a wide spectrum of people. There are people who follow politics very closely. And then there's a group that actually don't really understand much, right? So there's a lot of people who actually don't even know the difference between what is a member of parliament versus a minister, for example. And I actually feel like I fall into that latter group, surprisingly. There's a lot of things that I still don't understand and that I'm hoping to learn more about, And the thing is, I don't also want to say that that we are not intelligent as a community of political prude, right? I think the people that we speak to are quite smart. It's just that we've never really needed to understand.
Yeah. It's about what you pay attention to.
Yeah. And never really needed to figure out. But I feel like we are curious. So what I'm really hoping for this season of episodes is really to understand how things work in Singapore. And rather than asking you about policies, which obviously you work on, I want to ask you about how policies come to be, right? Because let me explain why this became a topic of interest of mine. Because recent work experiences of mine, I now run a small team. And with that, I try to practice a bit more thoughtful leadership. And when I have my team come in for pitch sessions or, brainstorming meetings, I don't always immediately understand or agree with the ideas that are presented to me sometimes. But for me to be a better leader, I want to genuinely be able to consider their ideas and also the way they think, right? And what I realize is that, by asking them to share with me their process, I'm better able to maybe understand their intention and maybe gain at least a deeper understanding, even if I don't change my stance, right? And I feel like that's that. And I want to apply that to the government because sometimes for me, it's I don't really see the process in which what goes behind policymaking. And when a new law is being announced sometimes or new policies are being announced, it's not always that I agree with them. It's not always that I go okay, yeah, that's a great policy. So what I'm trying to do is also maybe in the same way apply that same level of process to understand how things work And I think you're the perfect person to ask because you work with, policy makers.
Yes.
You are a policymaker.
Yes.
And I think you'll be able to explain it to me and the audience. Yeah.
Yes. I think it's an interesting question that you pose because it's always important to understand the context, the background, and then finally the perspective. Because otherwise, if you just understand the perspective, which is the idea that someone gives to you, but you actually don't understand the context in which he or her had actually developed those ideas, then you don't actually understand where they come from.
Yeah.
So I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah. So let's just jump right into it, right? And when it comes to problem solving, the whole process of problem evolving into policy, how does it start, right? Like, what is the first step and where does policy making to you actually begin?
There can be a variety of channels in which we develop our ideas around policies. Sometimes it's because we work with practitioners. So for example, I'm at the Ministry of Social and Family Development. So we work with social workers a lot, practitioners who are on the ground. And they interact with families who are in crisis, families who face family violence, for instance. And they will let us know, based on their interactions with these members of the public, what are the gaps they see on the ground, for instance. So that's one avenue. And then sometimes we just have feedback sessions, general ones, whereby we invite members of the public. So you don't have to be a person in the know. You don't have to be a practitioner or social worker. You can be a young person, and I think the NYC does a fair bit of that. And then sometimes we also develop our ideas based on feedback we get through surveys, which are conducted nationwide, Maybe we do a sampling about 1,000 odd people or so. So there can be different avenues in which feedback is gathered. And then we look at what is being done, what are the laws that are in place, and then we decide whether or not we actually need laws or we need policy changes. Not every policy needs to be empowered in law because there can be certain tweaks to programs and initiatives that you make on the ground. So we will have to decide when there needs to be legislative change, because with legislative change, you then empower certain public officers to be able to do certain things.
Right. Again, relating it to my own experience, right? So you said public feedback, is one of the major channels. And for me, I hold one-on-one meetings with my team members, and that's my way of gathering feedback, right?
Yes.
And I'm always asking, tell me what's working, tell me what's not working for you. And they all give me their different opinions and feedback. And obviously, I have a set of data points now.
Yes.
And then I have to then decide, okay, what is the more urgent matter to attend to?
Yes. Because
obviously, I have limited resources, So again, applying it to maybe your perspective from the government point of view, I also do think that, the government has limited resources to work with, whether it's personnel, time, or money. What is that consideration process like as to what is more urgent to tackle?
So there are some problems that, let me give you an example of an urgent problem. So one of my portfolios in the Ministry of Home Affairs is to look at scams prevention.
Okay.
Now that's an urgent problem.
Yep.
Right? Because every day someone is being scammed. In fact, we're losing $2 million per day based on last year's figures to scammers.
That's crazy.
Right? Yeah. And when the crime statistics come out for the full year 2024, you'll see that the numbers have increased in terms of losses to scammers. So that's an urgent problem because every single day there is a member of the public, we don't know who has fallen prey to a scam and has lost perhaps, lifetime earnings and so on and so forth. So that's urgent. It needs to be addressed. Right? And then there are also longer term issues whereby actually you need to have various building blocks in place before you can effect change meaningfully. I also look after preschool education in my portfolio at MSF. So when you want to look at how you can ensure that there is higher attendance rates, for example, for young children under the age of 5 or 6, that they have better attendance rates in preschool, then it's not just about it's not about actually saying that there is a law for compulsory education for preschool, but you actually have to look at the factors that are preventing these children from attending preschool. And then you see how you work with parents, how you motivate and incentivize them, and also look at what are the factors that are preventing these children from going to school. So there are two sets of problems, I think, that we're looking at. What you had earlier classified as urgent that we have to think about what are the measures we have to impose now and can be done now. And then there are some problems whereby you know that actually you have to take a longer term view, that it can't just be solved now with certain levers that you put in place, but you have to put in various different building blocks to ensure that the ecosystem is in place before you actually are able to get to the outcome that you desire.
It doesn't mean that, if an urgent problem is urgent, you only focus on the urgent and then no work gets done on the long term. So what is that process like in order to balance the two?
Actually, we do both things simultaneously. It's quite akin to what individuals do in your own family.
Yeah.
Right? There are certain things that you have to address urgently. For example, I have to pay a bill today. The deadline is today. That's urgent and I'm supposed to do it.
Yep.
Then there are certain things that are perhaps slightly medium term. For instance, my child may be taking, say, the PSLE next year or the year after. And I want to make sure that my child, has certain studying habits or, that I address certain issues that my child is facing, and that goal is perhaps 1 or 2 years down the road. But I don't think parents there will be some parents who are resource constrained and can only address urgent problems every single day. But I believe for every individual, right, it's a mix of what is needed in the medium to long term that you're planning for in your family and what you have to actually take care of today. So it's the same for in the government. We do a mix of both. And I think the examples I provided about fighting scams on a daily basis and what we do to put in the building blocks to ensure that there is good accessibility, affordability, and quality of preschool education for our children, that is something that we do every day as well. But the outcome is something that is a little bit more, we'll have to look at it in a medium to longer term perspective. Yeah.
Right. So let's go back to the urgent versus long-term problems.
Yes.
So maybe you could walk me through what that process looks like when a problem is being surfaced, right? So what's the first step that the ministry or whoever is working on the problem does? Is it confirming that it's a real problem? Is it like gathering more data points? Is it consulting experts? These are the initial thoughts that I have, right, with regards to having a problem. For example, if I face a problem, like a financial problem at work, I will go speak to a financial consultant. So like for the government side, like what is that process like actually?
A lot of the issues that the government faces, many of the issues are not new issues.
Okay.
Because in policy making, it's a multi-year process. Let me give you an example. I worked very intensely on laws and policies around preventing family violence. So family violence is not a new problem. It's not a new problem in any society. Ever since there were families. And that is like, there will be disputes amongst family members. And the question is sometimes, unfortunately, when disputes are not well managed, then people get harmed, get hurt. Right? So family violence is not a new problem. So coming back to your question, it wasn't like, new problem.
Okay.
Let's go address this. You can have something, there in the background, and you already have processes in place. Some of our, specialist agencies like PAVE has been around for decades, helping families with family violence issues. They have been doing their work steadily, a strong, steadfast partner in the community. But the government, we take a look at the numbers, we feel that I think we need to take a closer look at it now and ask ourselves if new laws need to be in place. And then we realize that there are situations whereby, because family violence happens within the family, that there can be family members who, even though they are being harmed, and we have examples, they do not wish to leave their homes. They do not wish to be extricated from the problem, and they also do not report it because they are worried about implicating their family member. So we then realize that, then we need to think about how do we empower our enforcement officers or social workers when you have a situation like this, because I don't think any of us, it will be on our conscience, if we know that someone is being subjected to daily abuse and yet we are not helping her because she doesn't want to be helped. I don't think we can just turn a blind eye to it. So we decided that we needed to have laws to address that. And that's why we included that into our amended laws in the Women's Charter to protect victims like that. So this is an example whereby a lot of good work has been done. Through what we're hearing from practitioners on the ground, we see certain cases where we then realize that these cases, we don't have the laws to be able to go in and protect the victim.
Okay.
Sometimes people may ask, are there enough, sufficient numbers? Sometimes I don't think it's a matter of how many cases there are. But if we know that we see this and the problem may worsen in the future, and it's possible because we have aging demographics. More and more, there could be elderly parents, and then for whatever reasons they stay with their children, it could blow up, And then we feel that we should go in. It is on our conscience. We have stakeholders buy in. People feel strongly that we shouldn't tolerate family violence in our society. So we have to go in, we put in the relevant laws, and then we debate that in Parliament. We have the support of parliamentarians. We also listen to experts on the ground, and we decide this is something we want to proceed on. So this is one example of how something comes to fruition.
Okay, so to make it clear for the audience, I would say if let's say it's a 3-step process, the first step would be engaging with the affected groups first.
Identifying gaps.
Okay.
Identifying gaps on the ground. And that it could be through a research exercise. It could be hearing feedback from specialists, practitioners on the ground. It can also be from members of the public.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then step 2 will be?
Step 2 would be, thinking through, discussing within the ministry as to what are the laws we have in place, where are the lacunas, where are the gaps, right? And then we sort of have to be a bit creative in this process to decide which is the law we have to amend. Or if there isn't such a law to amend in the first place, do we actually have to bring in something new altogether? And we have to then consult AGC, right?
Okay.
As in...
sorry, who's AGC again?
This is Attorney General's Chambers, yeah. So we have to find out whether does it contravene? Does it contravene an individual's rights? Right? Because in that case I presented just now, the consent of the individual is not provided. The mother does not actually want to be removed from the place of harm and also does not want to report on her son. Right? So then we have to ask ourselves, then who do we empower to make that decision for him or her, the victim?
Right.
So in this case, we brought in the Director General of Social Welfare.
Okay.
Somebody that the government is going to empower to make that decision. Right?
I understand.
Yeah. So we come up with an idea, right? So we think that, okay, this is what we think we're going to do in terms of the legislative change. Then the step after that, after we consult AGC, is that we have to word it, right? This process is not short.
Yeah.
6 months, a year. AGC drafts a lot of laws. They have to work on many policies and legislative changes, and then we have to bring it to Parliament. Before we bring it to Parliament, most of the time we publish the changes to the law on, say, a REACH website for at least a month, and then we listen to the public give comments as to whether they think this is workable. Sometimes the public says, actually, why are you doing this? Why don't you do that? That kind of thing. So it's a little bit iterative in that sense. We listen to feedback and then we debate it in Parliament. First reading, second reading, third reading. And then after we pass it through Parliament, the final step is operationalization. Let's not forget operationalization. Operationalization also means you need enough boots on the ground. People who are properly trained to be able to effect this change effectively on the ground. I think one important thing, and sometimes overlooked, about the effectiveness of the Singapore government, right, is that when we say we want to do something and we do it, we make sure we do it. We don't pass laws for the sake of just passing laws and ticking a checkbox to say I have a law. There's no point having a law that cannot be executed or operationalized on the ground.
So again, drawing from my vantage point from a media agency, right?
Yes.
So when I bring in team members to, let's say, come up with social media strategies, the people I'm hiring are then strategists, people who are familiar with social media spaces, who, understand the theories behind like mass communications and whatnot. So when it comes to the ministries and drawing back to the brainstorming process, like who are the people who are in that meeting room, coming up with the ideas and coming up with the solutions, like what kind of majors do they have? What is their experiences that allow them to be able to say, or to confidently say, I think this is a solution to this problem, for example? So
we have a good mix of people from different backgrounds in the civil service. And each time we take a look at changing laws, it could involve a team of, say, 10, 20 officers, and that's just within the parent ministry. Sometimes you have to work with civil servants and officers from other ministries as well. So, for example, in the family violence laws, it involves both my portfolios, Ministry of Social and Family Development and Ministry of Home Affairs. So many civil servants in the MHA actually have law enforcement backgrounds. Some of them come from the police force, for instance. And there are also others who have worked in other ministries before, but they have indicated that they want to come to MHA for posting. So there is a natural inclination. So that's the MHA side of the house, right? In MSF, we also have civil servants there. Some of the civil servants actually come from a very ground up. So they may have worked in a social service office before. They may have worked in the Community Development Council, a CDC, before. So they have ground experience, And some of them may have worked in other related ministries, say Ministry of Health, for instance. And that's not uncommon, because if you think about it, when someone is hurt, they go to the hospitals. So the hospitals are actually a channel and an avenue whereby victims are actually the cases get surfaced. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because we're looking at family violence, that it has to be a law enforcement officer. You actually look at people, civil servants with backgrounds in social work. Perhaps they have worked in a medical healthcare sector before. Some may have worked in education before, maybe because they have dealt with children before. So it's quite a broad mix. And we bring in all these different individuals to think about the ins and outs of this policy, and very importantly, how it's going to be applied and executed subsequently.
Understand. Okay. One more question I have, which is really going back to the steps, right? As to like problem to policy. The last step that we discussed was operationalization. Then I would say that there's a follow-up step after that, which is then checking whether or not it's successful or it is,
sustainable.
Yes. So what are some of the KPI metrics or indicators that the government uses to say, okay, this policy is working well or this policy is not working well? Because as much as we want to say that obviously we intend for all the policies to do well, sometimes they've been like from theory to practical might not translate, right? So how does the government assess that?
There are broad indicators. So for example, obviously GDP growth is one. Lowering inequality is another. So there are these broad indicators. But when you bring it down to individual ministries, then we obviously have different KPIs. So for example, I'm not in a revenue generating ministry. The Ministry of Social and Family Development is not supposed to generate revenue. Right? In fact, we are many a time giving out financial assistance. Right? So actually, if we were to use a corporate kind of a terminology, it's like a cost center. Right? Same for MHA, the indicators that we look at would be law and order. Right? And how do you put a price tag to it? We only know that because Singapore is a safe and orderly place, that investors from overseas are willing to invest in us. And our people, I think when you do surveys amongst our citizens, they all feel that Singapore is a safe place to be in, where you can walk safely about at night, without having to fear about being robbed or, having harm come your way, So different ministries would have different KPIs, so to speak. So coming back to family violence, domestic violence, the operationalization is that there must be, number one, channels for reporting for victims or survivors of family violence, right? Number two, when they report, somebody has to go there and help them, right? Number three is, what does help look like to that person? So number one of the things we do, one of the things we did when we amended the laws, this is not in the law, but one of the initiatives we rolled out at the same time was actually having this hotline, the National Anti-Violence and Sexual Harassment Helpline. So we wrote out a helpline, and then we made sure there are different channels. It's not just about calling, you can WhatsApp, you can text as well, and so on and so forth. That victims and survivors are able to call or message for help. That's number one, right? An avenue for reporting. At the same time, we roll out campaigns, break the silence campaigns to tell victims that it's all right to report, right? We will do something to help you, and we'll also help the perpetrator of family violence. Right? So we have a campaign to break the silence as well. That's number one. Number two, the officers who go down to help the survivor/victim. We have the Domestic Violence Emergency Response Team. This is staffed by both MSF officers as well as police officers on the ground. Why do I say that? Before we embarked on this exercise to change the laws, what happens is you call 999, police officer goes down, police officer only goes down. Police officer goes there, looks at whether harm and hurt has been caused, and then decides whether it's arrestable. If it's not grievous enough to arrest the perpetrator, the police officer goes away because it's not arrestable, right? The victim, the survivor, was like, I'm still in threat, right? I'm still under threat. At home, whoever this is, my spouse, may harm me. He has threatened to harm me. He hasn't yet harmed me, but he might, right? So what we have done after we amended the laws is we also at the same time developed this domestic violence emergency response team. Social worker goes down after the police receives a call for help. The social worker assesses, or the MSF officer assesses, whether or not a safety plan needs to be put in place for the individual. So for example, do we move this potential victim out of the house to a crisis shelter? Or if the threat is not so imminent, danger is not so imminent, do we come back tomorrow and decide on what, are the best alternatives for him or her? To move to a relative's house, if there are children in the situation, what do we do with the children, and so on and so forth? Does the perpetrator need counselling? Does there need to be a counselling session for both parties, and so on and so forth? So coming back to your question of KPIs, right? After we set up this domestic violence emergency response team, DVERT in short, we ask ourselves, how many cases are we looking at that DVERT has to address on a monthly basis? And we've kind of rolled it out since April last year, progressively, and it's now nationwide. We estimate that we may be looking at about 900 cases a year. Then we have to ask ourselves, do we have the manpower to do this? Do our officers know what they need to do? And of course, after they get the cases, like I said, there was safety planning and everything, right? You must make sure your crisis shelters have enough capacity, right? So finally, at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, right? So how do you know it actually has worked? This is quite new. We started it last year, right? But it is about what we hear from these families. Number one, has the perpetrator been effectively rehabilitated? Maybe he needs to be punished for causing hurt to someone, but maybe all he needed was counselling or mandatory treatment if he had mental health issues, right? And at the same time, does the spouse who was victimized, how does he or she feel? Does she feel safer? Are the children protected? In the longer term, does the family reunite? There can be cases where the family reunites. There can be cases where the family does not reunite, right? But we have to know that we at least tried to reunite the family. And if not, what do we do with the perpetrator? It's not just about punish. Nowadays, when we look at prisons, it's about captains of lives. It's not a prison warden going around to punish, inmates. Captains of lives, because we want to help perpetrators get onto the right path. So we look at it holistically, making sure that there are avenues for reporting, resources to help the victims/survivors, at the same time, rehabilitation of perpetrators. At the end of the day, we ask ourselves, do people in the ecosystem, do they feel that the situation has improved? We look at the cases over the years. Last year was the first time we released our annual report for domestic violence trends. We're going to be monitoring year after year as to what those trends look like. At the same time, we're going to look at our case management. How many cases are we seeing per year? How are those cases resolved? I think that is basically the way we look at the problem as a whole.
Understand. So from, let's say, like an SOP point of view, it's just basically data gathering on both quantitative...
Monitoring, yes.
Monitoring and both qualitative and quantitative.
Yes, qualitative is very important because every family is unique. Yeah.
Understand. Okay. So when it comes to like policy making, obviously different groups of society gets affected, right? And there will be trade-offs,
Yes.
and that's what I'm hoping to discuss as well. And maybe it might sound very lame to like you, but like I think a couple of years ago there was the new law. Back then it was new, but there was the law that was implemented whereby we cannot buy alcohol after 10:30, right? Okay. And that was I believe it was in response to like I think riots or something. And since then, I feel like the sentiment on the ground is that nightlife culture has been affected because of that. So like I think it's just like last week I was like on Instagram and then I was like looking at people sharing their opinions about this particular law, even though it's been years, right? So my question kind of is like, yes, laws can be implemented and yes, they benefit a majority, but we also cannot like disregard that there's a maybe minority that really hates it, right? So how do you balance that, and how do you make communities that are maybe not agreeable to the law or like frustrated with the law feel heard,
Maybe as a general point, I would say that we have laws and we do review our laws. So when I say we review, we take into account new context, new environment, or stakeholder feedback. So where stakeholders say that you had this law because there was a problem previously with this location or whatever it was, right? Then years later, 5 years, 8 years or whatsoever, we take a look at what are the statistics during this period of time. Has it come down? And has in police terms, we like to say modus operandi or whatsoever, of certain, criminal groups or whatsoever, has it changed, so on and so forth. So the question for us is the law still relevant? And where we feel that the law no longer needs to be so tight, for instance. So, for instance, it could come in the form of where there are establishments with certain license tenures. It could be that, previously you were on a watch list because you may have done something naughty or you broke the law or whatsoever, so we gave you a 1-year license, that kind of thing. But over time, we say, actually, your track record has improved, so maybe now we'll give you a license for 3 years.
Right.
So there are reviews, but I can't decide and say now that, which one needs to be reviewed. It really depends on the situation. It also depends on what we hear from the ground, from stakeholders. Yeah.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say that just because there's a law in place, that law is going to be what it is. You'll never change, come what may, we do listen to feedback and we welcome, members of the public to share that with us.
Okay. One thought process I had when listening to that is it can really be argued both ways, right? Because if let's say a particular law was implemented, then it solved a problem, and we see, for example, the statistics show that the numbers decreased. Yeah. So one, you can argue that the law should continue to be in place because the numbers decreased.
Yes.
And then the other way to argue it is well, we don't really need a law anymore because the numbers increased. The numbers decreased, right? So
but you never. It's a bit counterfactual, because you don't know whether numbers will pop up until you release.
Yeah.
By which point, you would have already amended the law or removed it, right?
Yeah. So how would that process be like then? And how do you determine, which is which?
So there are certain things like, for example, smoking. Should we have a all-round smoking ban, say, for instance, for individuals of a certain age and below? And the truth of the matter is, I think if we look around us, I think incidence rates of smoking are decreasing for younger people. I don't know whether that's true from what you see around you.
But in a bubble, people don't really smoke around.
Yeah, but I think it's when you look across, and I think the numbers bear out. I think younger folks, many of them don't smoke. It's not seen as so much a lifestyle choice or as before. So sometimes the question do you need actually a smoking ban? And sometimes the question may be that maybe there is no need to, because if you just look at the trends over time, actually less and less people are smoking. So it's just a general example, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that this is what we're actually considering right now, but I'm just using it as a general example. Yes. So the question, I guess, for us is that, where there are certain laws in place, like I mentioned earlier, we review to see whether circumstances have changed, right? Whether or not we can adjust some of the parameters of the law, or whether there really is no need for that law anymore, or whether that law actually takes on a different form. Right? It may be collapsed together with something else. We may take out certain penalties, adjust it, or take into account certain new offences that we come across. So there are changes and reviews and amendments to law. It takes place quite frequently. Right?
Okay.
And in other situations where we realize that actually things are going on quite nicely, rates are coming down, vices are coming down, so then we don't need laws for that, and we'll just continue to monitor, and we can just let it be. Yeah, that's another way of looking at it. Yeah.
Understand. If you made it this far into the episode, I'm guessing you're really enjoying the conversation. So why not show us some love? Give Political Prude a 5-star rating and hit that follow button on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, tap the thumbs up button and subscribe so that you don't miss out on upcoming episodes. Let's get back into it. So my question is also then, obviously, when it comes to like national policies or laws, there's always going to be people with opinions on them.
Yes.
And I feel like just because we are part of a generation that grew up on social media,
Yes.
that is our go-to ranting spot. Like we just go on to IG stories or TikTok and we just rant to the camera. Are there still, proper channels in which people should give their feedback? And two-part question. The second part to that is, does that mean that every feedback that goes through those proper channels, someone will attend to them or someone will, review them? Like how does that work?
I think for a very long time, we've always had Reach as a platform to gather feedback from members of the public. And that's a platform under the now MDDI, Ministry of Digital Development and Information. But with the Forward SG exercise, I think PM Lawrence Wong has shared that we want to make sure that we have more channels available for members of the public to co-create our shared future together. And I think MCCY is looking at various platforms. So they already have NYC and they now have citizens panels and, various work groups to bring in perspectives, especially from young people. So there will always be these platforms. And I think, given the complicated world that we live in and given that many of these problems, I think, don't have such straightforward answers where we need to consider the different views of stakeholders, I think these platforms and channels are going very important to hear the perspectives of people from different walks of life.
Right. So no offense, right? But I feel like people are always very skeptical of government outreach programs, and I draw it back again to my personal experience with like workplace feedback, right? Because there were times where my friends and I would just go for coffee or drinks and then we'll talk about work, right? And there are some companies that they feel like there's no point in giving feedback because it leads to nothing, And now that I'm running my own team, it's something that I'm very conscious about because I don't want it to feel like it's not a safe space to give honest feedback, right? So what I do is with every feedback session, it's always like follow-ups. Whether or not it leads to anything, I'll just let them know. And at the same time, it's like, whatever new policies that I put in place at the company, it is very transparent to everybody that this is due to a feedback that I received during a particular feedback process, So when it comes to the government, or maybe even Forward SG that you point out as an example, are there ways in which, we can see how feedback led to changes or led to policies being enacted? Yeah.
First and foremost, I think it's always good to have channels in place. Whether or not people may feel that, it's not organic or whatever it is, I think it's always better to have channels than to have no channels, right? Because, and I'm talking about formal channels. So the formal channels are the platforms I talked about. These are government platforms, right? But at the same time, we also hold regular engagement sessions with stakeholders. The example I previously shared on the MSF side of the house, whereby we bring in social workers, practitioners. That's where we hear from people who actually have experience working on the ground, right? So, but I think the question that you have in your mind is that, okay, so government hears all this feedback, right? So how do we know that it's actually been addressed? I think what's important is that when people come together, we decide on what is the pain point that we want to solve. What is the challenge that we face? And we also are quite clear-minded and clear-eyed, about what are the challenges and what are the trade-offs. I think this is the part where everybody needs to, in a way, play a part in, because it's not just about giving an idea. It's about, can this idea be executed? And if we were to execute this idea, what is the downstream impact? What are the externalities on other parties? And I think there needs to be conversations around this because it's not so naturally apparent to people who may not be in the government. I came from a private sector background, right? So I was in investment banking for more than a decade. When you're in the private sector, when you look at things, it's easy to look at it as like a firm level objective because firms, more often than not, they are profit-making enterprise. So my KPI is to ensure I meet the needs and demands of my client. I give him, for example, in investment banking terms, the highest valuation for his equity, for his share, for his stock, right? And there's a successful listing for the company at the end of the day. That is the KPI. I don't really care about the sustainability of the industry, or if I price this stock very high, how does it affect other comparables in the market? Am I leading to a market whereby there's going to be a bubble, and so on and so forth? Private sector individuals, they are not tasked to think about something system-wide. Their objective is to fulfill a firm level objective. And that's like basically your employment contract, right? It states what you're supposed to do. Whereas in the public sector, we have to consider all externalities, positive externalities as well as negative externalities. So I think what's important is that we all know that, number one, we welcome all forms of feedback to come in. At the same time, it's important to go to stage 2, which is let us discuss that if we were to do A, what happens to B, to C, to D? If we spend $1 here, where is that dollar coming from? Or where are we taking that dollar from? Because if we were to invest in a particular program, it may mean that the government is taking away resources from another program. Is that fair? Is that what we want to see? So I think there needs to be that conversation. And I think it is up to all the individuals who are involved in the process, the government included, right? That at the end of the day, we share that openly, transparently, as much as possible with people who are involved in that process, so that they feel that they've been heard, the issue has been considered, and that when that decision is finally made one way or the other, why that is so. So I think where we are right now, and this is an evolving process, the government is also learning. The Forward SG exercise has only been these past 2 years, right? As to now with all these platforms out there, now that we're bringing in people and ideas, how do we consolidate? How do we then decide? And then how do we then bring it forward? This is an evolving process. But I think one thing is very important, and I think it's the heart of the intention. The intention of this entire exercise is to co-create a shared future together. There is no bad intent from the government standpoint. We're not here to want to clamp down on ideas or to diss your ideas. That's not the point. We're here, we're doing all this because we want to hear, we want to discuss with you as to how we can bring this, to fruition, and how can we work on this together so that it's sustainable and good for generations to come. I think it's important. As long as we know we are all coming in with good intentions, we want to be constructive about it, then I think we can work on something together.
Yeah. That actually reminds me of some conversations that I have with peers in the corporate world, right? I'm always asking my friends who have work experience and whatnot on advice. And, feedback process has been really said to be so important in the corporate space, at the workplace, right? And that's what I really try to do as well. And one of the discussions that we had was that while the channels for feedback are in place, you really need to make them effective. And what people don't want to see is something that's performative, and like when I'm explaining all the different policies that I have at my company, at my team, my friends will tell me, okay, these all sound great, right? But like you need to make sure that there must be results and there must be actionable things that you did that people can say that it is truly a progressive company or truly an inclusive company, and not just for show, or not just to show, or it's not just something to put on your EVP on your website, right? Your employer value proposition, right? On that same vein, it's like, okay, I'm sure there will be people who look at Forward SG and say it's just something for them to say that they're doing something, or they like if let's say policies are in place, they'll just say, Forward SG will be their excuse to say that people were hurt, right? So how do we then look at Forward SG as something that is being actually used in the policymaking process? That's my question, actually.
Okay. Like I mentioned, Forward SG is quite new and it's still an evolving process. Let me give you an example of something that has happened, slightly predates Forward SG, but the spirit is the same.
Okay.
So I think that's an example of how this may be translated moving forward. I was very involved in the white paper on women's development in Singapore.
Okay.
Right. So we spoke to many stakeholders. We involved people, about 6,000 people, men and women, across different age groups. We had FGDs, we had surveys, a variety of different things. I had 40 to 50 meetings, with women groups and so on and so forth. And throughout the exercise, it was about 1.5, 2 years, we came together, we put together a white paper on women's development. So it was very thorough. We had different domains. So for example, workplace practices, are they fair? Caregiving and home responsibilities. And then we had a section on protecting women, in family violence from online harms, for instance. And then we had mindset shifts and so on and so forth. So different domains. And the last domain was protecting vulnerable women. So we had different domains. And for each different domain, we had different action points. So there were a total of about 25 proposals, 5 domains, 25 proposals, 25 action points. Family violence was one of them, right? So after we laid it out, and this was after a huge consultation process with stakeholders and members of the public, we lay out the 25 action points, we debated that in Parliament, Parliament passed it, and we also told ourselves we're going to do regular check-ins on where we are progressing with this. So we had a discussion in Parliament in 2022. Our next check-in is 2027. It's a 10-year roadmap. And it's not just we only work on it in 2027. We don't just work on it in 5 years after that because it's a 10-year road plan, right? It's not only at those junctures that we review what we're doing. Every single year, there is an interministerial committee in place whereby senior officers from the relevant ministries will come together and ask ourselves, where are we on this 10-year roadmap? So I think the principle of it, how it's being done, I think will be reflected in the Forward SG exercise as well. We are now part of this listening to everyone, gathering feedback. We have a Forward SG, information booklet out there. We have a roadmap. PM Lawrence Wong has launched it. I'm going to have regular check-ins. Where are we? Where are we for the different ministries doing for different things? And at suitable platforms, at budgets, announcements, and National Day rallies, the PM would be updating on where we are in this process. So I think to give people the assurance that something is being done, I think what's important is, number one, frequency and regularity of updates. I think people don't want to feel that I gave you a feedback on something and then it went into this big black hole and I never heard about it ever again. You may not hear about it immediately in the first 1 month after you put it in. Doesn't mean that it's not being looked into, because earlier I shared that policy making sometimes can take 1 year, 2 years, especially when it involves legislative changes, right? So I urge people who are interested in the process to take a slightly medium to longer term look at it, because policy making, we don't want to have a situation, Singapore is not known for that also, whereby today we do this and then the next day we do that. We swing from one side of the pendulum to the other. That's not how policies work. It doesn't give people assurance and stakeholders assurance, because you can flip-flop and change just because things change very drastically, So I think people should take a slightly medium to longer term and ask ourselves, are we on the right trajectory? So what I mentioned earlier, regularity as well as frequency of those updates are important. That's number one. Number two, just because you've given in your feedback, don't just stop there. You know who are the decision makers, which ministry is involved. Continue to follow up with them. Maybe in 6 months' time, try to find out where we are, or I participated in this discussion. Is there going to be another discussion after that? Where can I get that update from? And I think different public office holders at different junctures would address the issue. If that's an issue that we have all decided is something that we need to look at together. So I think that's important. The closing of the loop. So number one, frequency, regularity of the update, and the closing of the loop. At the end of the day, an idea or a proposal may or may not be taken up. But I think what's important to the individual who provided it is that he or she knows that that idea has been heard, has been thought through, And at the end of the day, a decision has been made because the trade-offs have been considered.
Earlier on in our conversation, you talked about deciding whether or not to make something legislation, right? And I did say I wanted to ask you what that criteria looks like. So how does the government decide whether or not something should be law or not?
Fundamentally, legislation serves the purpose of needing to empower certain organs of the government or officers of the government to do certain things. So for some policies and programs, you do not actually need to change the law to empower, because you don't need an officer to be empowered to do something.
Okay.
For instance, so you then do not need it legislated. Another aspect of it where you need legislation is where, unfortunately, you need to have certain penalties for offences that needs to be legislated. So, for example, in the Ministry of Home Affairs, we need to legislate certain laws. Like, for example, if you have an offence A, what is the maximum sentencing? That because you have to you have to have that, right? It cannot be somebody's whim and fancy.
Yep.
Right? So that needs to be legislated. So I think we have to consider it from that perspective. Or when I talked about empowering officers, sometimes we have to work. So, for instance, there is a lot happening in the online space. We need to work with social media companies, right? So we have the Online Criminal Harms Act. The government officer, needs to be empowered to say to a social media company that if I let you know that there is this online harm that is happening, right? For instance, scams are being perpetuated on a certain platform that you have, false information, right? And this is to the detriment of the individual. For example, there's a false advertisement telling people to invest in something that is a scam, for instance. I am empowered to tell you, and that if you do not take it down, there will be penalties on the social media company's part. That needs to be legislated. Certain things whereby it's not like an offense, it's good to have, we'll put that into a code of practice. Right? So therein lies that difference. I hope that addresses your problem.
Yes.
So not everything needs to be legislated.
Yeah.
It's only when you need to empower a public officer, then you need it in legislation.
Okay. So earlier on you mentioned how not everything needs a law to be put in place, right? You can put in the foundations and the building blocks to lead to an organic outcome, that you intend or the stakeholders intend. But then I also think that that's not quite what I think how Singapore works, because when we look at the Singapore success story, I feel like it's because during Lee Kuan Yew's era, he was like, okay, I want this to be done, let's do it. And then a law gets enforced and put into place. And we see that led to our success story. So do you think things have changed since then?
I think Singaporeans now have diverse perspectives, right? They have traveled, they have seen the world, they have seen how things can be done differently. And also, I think what we've been discussing about trade-offs are very real, right? So the challenges that we face now are also much more multifaceted. So what I explained earlier in terms of the decision-making process, this is our way of putting in a system so that people know that, if I give a feedback, I feel this way, that this is being considered, we discuss it, we are co-creating something together, right? Actually, it does make policy making more difficult if you think about it. More time needs to be invested, right? But we feel that this is something we need to do because Singapore is a place where citizens have to feel ownership and they have to decide collectively that this is the way we want Singapore to go. And citizens may also feel that you don't know better than I do. So we all want to be heard, and I have a certain view. So our current decision-making process takes into consideration the views of the citizens and how they want to be involved in that process. And I think this is where Singapore is right now. So yes, I would agree with you that because of these processes we have in place, that decision-making is slower. But it doesn't mean that the decisions are worse off, right? And we hope that, and that's why the point about intention and being constructive is important, because if we all have the right intentions and we want Singapore moving in a certain way, then people have to understand that when we bring in all these different perspectives, that there is a trade-off in terms of time and resourcing. And if we can agree on what the trade-offs are and we can live with it, then we need to proceed.
Okay, I do want to wrap up our conversation already, but before you leave, was there anything that you would like the audience to take away from today's episode, really?
I sometimes feel when we talk to people that there is a little bit of a suspicion, or sometimes I would say pessimism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, are you for real? You know, skepticism, I would say, right? You know, if I have a wish list, I hope that we can come to the table and discuss with a kind of understanding in the back of our minds that actually the person opposite me who's having the conversation with me is starting off with good intentions and from a good place. And I think it is when we have those assumptions that it is more likely that we're going to be able to have a constructive discussion. If we start off with a bit of a negative mind frame, then I think, you know, the vibes where we get to, I don't think it might necessarily put us on a good trajectory. So I would say that that is what I hope that I can experience for myself and encourage others who may not be so familiar with how the government or how policies are made to approach this with a positive mindset.
On my end, I also feel like, you know, in order for people to have that positive mindset, there must be trust, right?
Of course.
There must be trust.
Yes,
and
very important.
Maybe to allow them to understand where you're coming from as well. Like what is that maybe one value or principle that anchors you when it comes to decision making as someone in your position?
We must be able to live by our decisions.
Okay.
Knowing that what we decide to do today doesn't just impact the people around us here today. It's going to impact generations to come, our children, our children's children. And sometimes you may not feel or see the outcomes immediately, but it doesn't mean that the outcomes are not there in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years' time. So we have to be able to live with the decisions we make.
Very nicely said. Thank you, Ms. Sun. Really appreciate you taking the time to explain everything. I'm actually really proud of this episode. Like, I think I'm walking away a lot more informed, which I really wanted to be when I entered this conversation. So appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to explain everything to us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I came into this conversation wanting to understand how policymaking actually works, how problems turn into policies, who make the calls, and what trade-offs have to be made along the way. And I think we got some real insight as to how complex that process really is. So if you've ever felt like politics is distant or that policies just happen, I hope that this conversation showed us that there's a lot more that goes on under the surface. And maybe, just maybe, it's worth paying a little more attention. This has been Political Prude, the podcast, Season 2. If you found this episode interesting, share it with a friend, post about it, and let's keep the conversation going. And if you're curious about more behind-the-scenes workings of Singapore, check out past episodes like How Foreign Diplomacy and Embassies Work in Singapore with British High Commissioner Nick Mehta, or How Singapore Manages Its Money with OCBC's Selina Ling. Now make sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more people. You can also find clips and updates on our socials, so stay connected there. I'll see you next time. This was the Zoda Pop Podcast.